The morning of Monday, September 21st, 1942, broke cold and gray over Boeing Field in Seattle, Washington. On the tarmac sat a machine that defied the conventional logic of aviation physics. It was the Boeing B-29, a silver behemoth with a wingspan of 141 feet, glistening under the low Pacific Northwest clouds. At the controls was Edmund T. Allen, known to his colleagues as Eddie, the most respected test pilot in the United States. Beside him sat a crew of hand-picked engineers and flight technicians, their faces etched with a mixture of professional stoicism and underlying dread. This was the first flight of a $3 billion gamble, a project so massive and so secret that its budget dwarfed the Manhattan Project, which was simultaneously attempting to harness the power of the atom. The Superfortress was not just a plane. It was a pressurized, remote-controlled, four-engine declaration of industrial supremacy. As Eddie Allen pushed the throttles forward, the four Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone engines roared into life. Each engine was a masterpiece of complexity, featuring 18 cylinders in a twin-row radial configuration, capable of producing 2,200 horsepower. But as the 105,000-pound aircraft began its takeoff roll, the engineers in the back were less concerned with horsepower and more concerned with temperature. The R-3350 was notoriously prone to overheating. It was an engine designed in a vacuum of peace and rushed into production for a world at war. To save weight, the engine crankcase was made of magnesium, a metal that burns with a white-hot intensity that is nearly impossible to extinguish once ignited. As the B-29 lifted off the runway, the vibration was immense, a physical manifestation of the raw power and the inherent instability of the design. This first flight was a success, but the shadow of technical failure loomed over every minute of the 90-minute sortie. To understand the desperation behind the B-29, one must look back to the vision of Major General Henry Hap Arnold, the commanding general of the United States Army Air Forces. Long before the attack on Pearl Harbor, Arnold realized that if the United Kingdom fell, or if the bases in the Pacific were lost, the United States would need a very long-range bomber. This requirement, known as the VLR project, demanded an aircraft that could carry a significant bomb load over 5,000 miles. In 1940, this was considered science fiction. The B-17 Flying Fortress, the backbone of the American air effort, was a short-range tactical tool by comparison. The B-29 was intended to be a strategic sledgehammer, capable of striking the Japanese home islands from bases thousands of miles away. The engineering hurdles were staggering. The most revolutionary feature was the pressurized cabin. In earlier bombers, crews had to wear heavy, sheepskin-lined flight suits and breathe through oxygen masks for hours on end in temperatures that could drop to 60 degrees below zero. This caused extreme fatigue and frostbite. The B-29 changed everything by creating 3 separate pressurized compartments connected by a long, narrow tunnel over the bomb bays. For the first time, a bomber crew could fly in shirt sleeves at 30,000 feet. Their environment controlled like a modern airliner. This innovation allowed for longer missions and better crew performance, but it added thousands of pounds of weight and thousands of potential points of failure. If a single window or seal failed at high altitude, the explosive decompression could be fatal. The second great innovation was the central fire control system. Instead of gunners sitting behind their weapons, exposed to the elements and limited by their own physical strength, the B-29 used a series of 5 remote-controlled turrets. Using an early analog computer system developed by General Electric, gunners used small sighting stations to track enemy fighters. The computer calculated the range, lead, and gravity drop, and the turrets followed the gunner's movements with mechanical precision. This was the birth of automated warfare. But like the engines, it was temperamental. The vacuum tubes and complex wiring were sensitive to the extreme vibrations and temperature shifts of high-altitude flight. By early 1943, the project was in a state of crisis. On Thursday, February 18, 1943, during a second test flight of the B-29, tragedy struck. An engine fire broke out in the number 2 engine. Eddie Allen, ever the professional, attempted to bring the burning giant back to Boeing Field. The fire, fueled by the magnesium components, burned through the wing spar. The aircraft crashed into the Fry meat packing plant, killing Allen and his entire crew of 10, along with 20 workers on the ground. The program was on the verge of cancellation. Hap Arnold, however, refused to blink. He poured more resources into the project, moving production to a massive new factory in Wichita, Kansas, and another in Marietta, Georgia. The B-29 was now too big to fail. It was the ultimate expression of the American arsenal of democracy. But it was eating up resources that could have built thousands of smaller, proven aircraft. The logistical challenge was the next hurdle. With the Central Pacific Islands still under Japanese control in 1943, the only way to bomb Japan was from bases in China. This led to the birth of Operation Matterhorn. The plan was audacious and, in hindsight, nearly impossible. B-29s would fly from bases in India, hop over the Himalayan mountains, refuel in Chengdu, China, and then strike Japan. The problem was that every gallon of fuel and every ton of bombs used in China had to be flown over the Hump, the world's most dangerous air route over the Himalayas, by the B-29s themselves, or by overburdened C-46 and C-47 transport planes. It took 6 B-29 transport missions to provide enough fuel and supplies for a single B-29 combat mission. On Thursday, June 15, 1944, Operation Matterhorn finally transitioned from a logistical nightmare to a combat reality. 68 B-29s took off from Chengdu, bound for the Yawata Iron and Steel Works on the island of Kyushu. This was the first time American bombers had struck the Japanese home islands since the Doolittle Raid of 1942. The world watched with bated breath, but the results were catastrophic. The precision bombing, which the Army Air Forces had championed as their primary doctrine, was a total failure. Only one bomb hit the target area. One aircraft was lost to anti-aircraft fire, several more were lost to mechanical failures, and the engines continued to overheat and catch fire with terrifying frequency. General Curtis LeMay, a man known for his bluntness and tactical ruthlessness, was sent to India to take over the XX Bomber Command. He arrived to find a demoralized force operating a machine that seemed more interested in killing its own pilots than the enemy. The B-29s were being pushed to their absolute limits. The R-3350 engines were still failing. During takeoffs in the blistering heat of India, pilots would hold their breath, watching the cylinder head temperature gauges climb into the red. If an engine failed during the critical seconds after liftoff, the heavily laden bomber would often settle back into the trees, becoming a massive fireball. LeMay quickly realized that the India-China logistics were a dead end. The cost of getting a single bomb over Japan from China was astronomical, and the results were negligible. He began to look toward the Mariana Islands, specifically Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, which were being liberated by the Marines and the Army in the summer of 1944. These islands would provide a direct sea lane for supplies and a much shorter route to Tokyo. But as the first B-29s of the 73rd Bomb Wing began to arrive on Saipan in October 1944, a new and unexpected enemy appeared in the skies. When the bombers reached their cruising altitude of 30,000 feet over Japan, they encountered winds of such ferocious speed that the aircraft were sometimes pushed backward or accelerated to speeds that tore the control surfaces apart. They had discovered the jet stream, a high-altitude atmospheric current that no one had fully accounted for in the mission planning. Precision bombing from 30,000 feet was proving to be a physical impossibility. The bombs would be swept miles off target by the 200-mile-per-hour winds. By the end of 1944, the B-29 program was at a crossroads. It was the most expensive weapon system in history, yet it had failed to deliver a knockout blow. The engines were still unreliable, the logistics were a nightmare, and the doctrine of high-altitude precision bombing was being dismantled by the very atmosphere of the planet. Hap Arnold was under immense pressure from Washington to justify the billions spent. He turned to LeMay and gave him a simple, terrifying mandate. Find a way to make the B-29 work, or the program, and perhaps the future of an independent Air Force, would die. LeMay began to contemplate a radical change in strategy, one that would abandon everything the Air Corps believed in and turn the B-29 into a weapon of total, indiscriminate destruction. He sat in his humid office on Saipan, looking at the reconnaissance photos of the sprawling wooden industrial districts of Tokyo. The high-altitude daylight raids were failing. The jet stream was making a mockery of their Norden bomb sites. The R-3350 engines were still exploding. If the Superfortress was to save itself and the American strategic effort, it would have to descend from the clouds and enter a realm of fire that no one had yet dared to explore. But the risks of such a move were unthinkable. If he sent the world's most expensive bombers in at low altitude, they would be vulnerable to every light anti-aircraft gun and night fighter the Japanese possessed. It was a gamble that could end the war or result in the greatest aerial slaughter in history. By October 1944, the center of gravity for the air war against Japan had shifted from the muddy runways of India to the coral outcrops of the Mariana Islands. The liberation of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam provided the United States Army Air Forces with something India could never offer: a direct deep-water supply line from the west coast of the United States. No longer would fuel and bombs have to be ferried over the Himalayas. However, the move to the Marianas brought a new set of challenges that threatened to render the $3 billion Superfortress obsolete before it could prove its worth. Brigadier General Haywood Hansell, commander of the 21st Bomber Command, was a true believer in the doctrine of high-altitude, daylight precision bombing. He believed that by using the sophisticated Norden bomb sight from 30,000 feet, his crews could knock out Japanese aircraft engine plants and steel mills with surgical precision. On Friday, November 24, 1944, Hansell launched Operation San Antonio the Fern, the first raid on Tokyo from the Marianas. 111 B-29s took off from Saipan's Isley Field, heading north across 1,500 miles of open ocean. Among them was the dauntless Dottie, piloted by Robert Morgan, who had gained fame as the pilot of the Memphis Belle in Europe. As the bombers reached their target altitude, they encountered a phenomenon that left the navigators and pilots in a state of shock. The B-29s, despite their powerful engines, were suddenly being shoved across the sky at incredible speeds. In some cases, their ground speed exceeded 450 miles per hour. In others, when turning into the wind, they appeared to stand still. They had flown directly into the jet stream, a high-velocity river of air that moved at speeds over 200 miles per hour. The impact on bombing accuracy was catastrophic. The Norden bomb sight, a mechanical marvel of its time, simply could not compensate for such extreme wind drift and ground speeds. The bombs were released into a chaotic atmosphere that carried them miles away from the intended industrial targets. Of the 100-plus aircraft that participated in the raid, only a handful of bombs actually struck the Musashino aircraft engine plant. To make matters worse, the climb to 30,000 feet and the struggle against the jet stream put an intolerable strain on the Wright R-3350 engines. More aircraft were being lost to mechanical failure and ditching in the Pacific than to Japanese interceptors. Back in Washington, General Hap Arnold was losing patience. The B-29 program was under intense scrutiny from Congress and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The astronomical cost of the project had to be justified by results, and Hansel's commitment to precision bombing was yielding nothing but missed targets and worn-out engines. In January 1945, Arnold made a ruthless decision. He relieved Hansel of command and replaced him with Major General Curtis LeMay, the man who had attempted to make the China-based operations work. LeMay was not a theorist. He was a pragmatist who measured success in destroyed acreage. He arrived in Guam with a cigar clamped between his teeth and a mandate to produce results by any means necessary. For the first few weeks, LeMay followed Hansel's playbook, attempting more high-altitude daylight raids. On Tuesday, January 23rd, and again on Sunday, February 4th, he sent his bombers against Nagoya and Kobe. The results remained abysmal. Clouds obscured the targets. The jet stream continued to scatter the bomb loads, and the Japanese anti-aircraft fire was becoming increasingly accurate at high altitudes. LeMay spent nights poring over reconnaissance photos and intelligence reports. He noticed two critical things. First, Japanese industry was not centralized in massive factories like those in Germany. It was decentralized into thousands of small household workshops located in densely packed residential districts. Second, Japanese night defenses were almost non-existent compared to their daylight capabilities. LeMay began to formulate a plan that was so radical it bordered on the suicidal. He decided to abandon the entire doctrine of the Army Air Forces. He would no longer fly in daylight. He would no longer fly at high altitudes. And he would no longer use high-explosive bombs to target specific factories. Instead, he would send the B-29s in at night, at altitudes between 5,000 and 9,000 feet, carrying thousands of pounds of incendiary clusters. To maximize the bomb load and increase the speed of the aircraft, he ordered something that horrified his crews. They were to strip the B-29s of nearly all their defensive machine guns and ammunition. Only the tail gunner would remain. This would lighten the aircraft by several thousand pounds, allowing for more fuel and a massive increase in the number of M69 incendiary bomblets. The M69 was a specialized weapon designed specifically for the unique architecture of Japanese cities. It was a 19-pound pipe filled with napalm-thickened gasoline. When dropped in clusters, these pipes would break apart and deploy small streamers to stabilize their fall. Upon impact, a timed fuse would ignite a black powder charge, spitting the burning gel up to 100 feet in all directions. LeMay knew that the wooden, paper-walled homes of Tokyo, packed tightly together in the Shitamachi district, would burn like kindling. The low-altitude approach would also keep the B-29s below the most effective range of Japanese heavy anti-aircraft guns and away from the turbulent jet stream. The risks were immense. If the Japanese night fighters were prepared, or if their radar-guided searchlights were effective, the stripped-down, low-flying B-29s would be sitting ducks. LeMay did not inform his superiors in Washington of the full details of the plan until the very last moment. He took the entire responsibility upon his own shoulders. If the mission failed, he expected to be court-martialed. If it succeeded, he might end the war. The crews were briefed in hushed tones. They were told to fly individually, not in formation, and to navigate by the glow of the fires started by the lead Pathfinder aircraft. On the afternoon of Friday, March 9, 1945, the airfields of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam became hives of frantic activity. The ground crews worked in the tropical heat to load 334 superfortresses with over 2,000 tons of incendiaries. The pilots, many of them barely out of flight school, looked at their stripped-down aircraft with a sense of naked vulnerability. They were being asked to fly at the height of a skyscraper into the heart of the world's most densely populated city, without the protection of their guns and without the safety of altitude. As the sun began to set over the Philippine Sea, the first B-29s began their takeoff rolls. One by one, the silver giants lifted off, their engines straining under the heaviest loads they had ever carried. The sound of over 300 Wright duplex Cyclone engines echoed across the islands, a low, rhythmic thrum that shook the coral foundations. Each plane was separated by 50-second intervals. They would fly for 7 hours across the dark Pacific, guided only by the stars and their rudimentary radar. In the lead aircraft of the 73rd Bomb Wing, the Pathfinders prepared their specialized M47 phosphorus bombs to mark the X on the map of Tokyo. As the massive fleet droned toward the Japanese coast, the crews sat in the eerie silence of their pressurized cabins, now redundant at the low altitudes they were maintaining. They watched the waves of the Pacific pass just a few thousand feet below them. Ahead lay the Shitamachi district, a 12-square-mile area of Tokyo where over 1 million people lived and worked in the shadow factories that fueled the Japanese war machine. The night was clear, but a stiff wind was blowing from the north. A wind that LeMay knew would act as a bellows for the fires he was about to ignite. Back at the command center on Guam, LeMay sat in total silence, waiting for the first radio transmission. He had gambled the entire B-29 program, the lives of over 3,000 airmen, and the moral standing of the American air effort on a single, brutal night. He knew that the world was about to see the Superfortress in its true, terrifying capacity, not as a precision instrument of engineering, but as a bringer of an elemental force that no city in history had ever survived. As the first aircraft crossed the Japanese coastline at Choshi Point, the searchlights began to sweep the sky, searching for the low-flying shadows that were closing in on the capital. The crews could see the dim lights of Tokyo ahead, a city that had no idea that the very atmosphere around it was about to be turned into a furnace. The bomb bay doors began to creak open, and the first of the Pathfinders took aim at the center of the target zone, unaware that the fire they were about to start would create its own weather, a thermal cyclone that would defy the laws of nature. Shortly after midnight on Saturday, March 10th, 1945, the first Pathfinder B-29s of the 73rd Bomb Wing arrived over the Shitamachi district of Tokyo. The city below was largely dark, though the silhouettes of the dense wooden housing were visible under a pale moon. The lead aircraft, piloted by specialized crews, released their M47 incendiary bombs. These were not aimed at individual buildings, but were designed to create a massive glowing X across the target zone. As the phosphorus and napalm ignited, the dark heart of Tokyo was suddenly etched with a brilliant, flickering cross of fire. This was the signal for the main force of 325 superfortresses, trailing behind in a long, predatory line, to begin their low-level runs. Flying at altitudes as low as 5,000 feet, The B-29 crews experienced something they had never encountered at the freezing heights of 30,000 feet. As the incendiaries began to fall in clusters of 500-pound canisters, the city below transformed into a sea of liquid flame. Within 30 minutes, the individual fires started by the Pathfinders began to merge. This was the birth of a firestorm, a meteorological phenomenon where the intense heat creates its own localized weather system. The air over the city became so hot that it rose at incredible speeds, drawing in cold air from the surrounding areas to create ground-level winds of hurricane force. These winds acted as a massive bellows, feeding the flames with a constant supply of oxygen and pushing the temperature toward a 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the B-29s, the experience was harrowing. The massive bombers, stripped of their guns and flying at lower speeds to conserve fuel, were tossed around like paper planes by the violent thermal updrafts. Pilots struggled with the controls as the aircraft were suddenly shoved upward by thousands of feet in mere seconds. The smell of the burning city began to permeate the pressurized cabins, a heavy, sickly scent of charred wood and chemicals that the air filtration systems could not eliminate. The heat radiating from the ground was so intense that some crews reported the aluminum skin of their bombers felt hot to the touch. As the raid progressed, the Shitamachi district became an inescapable furnace. The M69 bomb blitz had done their work with clinical efficiency, turning the residential clusters into a unified mass of fire. By the time the last B-29 turned back toward the Marianas at 4 a.m., 16 square miles of Tokyo had been erased from the map. Over 1 million people were left homeless. The official death toll was estimated at over 100,000, a number higher than the immediate casualties of either Hiroshima or Nagasaki. It was the single most destructive aerial raid in human history. Curtis LeMay, monitoring the reports from Guam, realized that his gamble had paid off. The B-29 was no longer an experimental failure. It was the ultimate instrument of total war. The success of Operation Meeting House fundamentally changed the nature of the B-29 campaign. In the weeks that followed, LeMay launched similar low-altitude incendiary raids against Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, and Yokohama. The industrial output of Japan began to plummet as the shadow factories in the residential districts were incinerated. However, while the firebombing captured the headlines and the attention of the Japanese leadership, another B-29 operation was quietly unfolding that would prove equally, if not more, decisive in the eventual collapse of the empire. This was Operation Starvation. Initiated in late March 1945, Operation Starvation moved the B-29 away from its role as a strategic bomber and toward a role as a high-precision naval mine layer. The mission was conceived by the Navy, but executed by the 313th Bombardment Wing, based on Tinian. The goal was to place thousands of sophisticated acoustic and magnetic mines in the narrow shipping lanes and harbor entrances of the Japanese home islands. Japan was a nation almost entirely dependent on maritime trade for food, raw materials, and fuel. By sealing the Shimonoseki Strait and the ports of Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya, the B-29s could effectively place a noose around the neck of the Japanese economy. The mining missions required a level of navigational precision that rivaled the early daylight bombing raids. The B-29s had to fly at very low altitudes, often under 5,000 feet, and release their heavy parachute-retarded mines at specific coordinates in the pitch-black night. To do this, they relied heavily on their AN/APQ-13 radar systems, which allowed them to see the coastlines and harbor features through darkness and cloud cover. It was a tedious, dangerous task. The Japanese, realizing the threat to their survival, increased the density of their light anti-aircraft batteries along the coastlines. The results of Operation Starvation were staggering and immediate. In just a few months, the B-29s laid over 12,000 mines. Japanese merchant shipping, already decimated by American submarines, found itself trapped. Ships that dared to leave or enter the ports were blown apart by mines they could not see and had no way to sweep. The flow of coal, iron ore, and, most importantly, rice slowed to a trickle. By June 1945, the Japanese maritime transportation system had essentially ceased to function. Factories that had survived the firebombing were forced to close because they had no raw materials. The civilian population began to face actual starvation, with the daily calorie intake dropping to dangerous levels. Prince Fumimaro Konoe later remarked that the B-29 mining campaign was just as effective as the direct bombing of cities. The Superfortress had proven to be a multi-role weapon of terrifying versatility. It could incinerate a city one night and paralyze a nation's trade the next. However, despite the utter destruction of the industrial base and the total blockade of the islands, the Japanese military leadership remained defiant. They were preparing for a final, suicidal defense of the home islands, known as Operation Ketsugo, involving millions of soldiers and thousands of kamikaze aircraft. The cost to the American air crews continued to mount. The Wright R-3350 engines remained a persistent threat. Even in late 1945, crews were still losing engines during the long, 7-hour hauls across the Pacific. The ditch and rescue system, involving submarines and B-29 Super Dumbo search and rescue planes, became a highly organized lifeline. But the psychological toll of flying over thousands of miles of hostile water in a mechanically temperamental aircraft was immense. The B-29 was a high-performance machine pushed to its absolute breaking point, maintained by ground crews who worked 20-hour shifts in the tropical sun to keep the giants in the air. In early July 1945, a new unit began to arrive at Northfield on Tinian. This unit, the 509th Composite Group, was different from the other B-29 wings. Its aircraft were kept in high-security hangars, surrounded by armed guards. The nose art on their planes was conservative, and their crews did not participate in the mass firebombing raids. They flew strange solo training missions, dropping single large pumpkin bombs, non-nuclear, high-explosive replicas, on specific Japanese targets. The rest of the B-29 airmen looked on with curiosity and a touch of resentment at these specialists, who seemed to be sitting out the hardest parts of the war, unknown to most. These silver-plated B-29s, which had been further modified to remove even more weight and improve engine cooling, were the final piece of the puzzle. They were part of Project Alberta, the operational arm of the Manhattan Project. While LeMay's bombers were systematically dismantling the physical infrastructure of Japan, the 509th was preparing to deliver a blow that would target the very psychology of the Japanese state. The B-29, the aircraft that had cost more than the atomic bomb itself, was now the only vehicle capable of carrying that very bomb to its destination. By the end of July, the tactical situation was clear. Japan was a hollow shell. Its air force was grounded for lack of fuel. Its navy was at the bottom of the ocean, and its cities were charred ruins. Yet, the anticipated surrender did not come. The B-29s continued their daily and nightly missions, the rhythm of destruction becoming a grim routine. On July 26th, the Potsdam Declaration was issued, demanding the unconditional surrender of Japan or the threat of prompt and utter destruction. To the Japanese leadership, this sounded like the same rhetoric they had been hearing for months. They did not know that a single B-29, sitting in a specialized pit on Tinian, was currently being loaded with a weapon that would render the very concept of the 1,000-plane raid obsolete. Colonel Paul Tibbets, the commander of the 509th, watched as the technicians gingerly maneuvered a 10-foot-long, 4-ton device nicknamed Little Boy into the bomb bay of his B-29, which he had named the Enola Gay. This was the moment the B-29 program had been building toward, and since 1940. All the engineering failures, the $3 billion, the lost crews, and the tactical shifts had led to this singular point. The Superfortress was about to transition from a weapon of conventional destruction to the harbinger of a new and terrifying age. As Tibbets and his crew prepared for the final briefing on the evening of Sunday, August 5th, the weather scouts reported clear skies over the primary target, a city that had so far been spared the firebombing, waiting as a pristine laboratory for the ultimate test of the Superfortress's capability. The specialized B-29s of the 509th Composite Group were unlike any other Superfortresses in the Pacific. Known by the code name Silverplate, these aircraft had been stripped of almost all defensive armament and armor plating to save weight. They featured reversible pitch propellers and fuel-injected R-3350 engines that were far more reliable than the early production models. The bomb bay doors had been modified with a single-arc pneumatic system to ensure they could snap open and shut in seconds, a necessity for the high-altitude release of the heavy atomic devices. On Monday, August 6, 1945, at 2:45 a.m., the Enola Gay accelerated down the long coral runway of Tinian's North Field. Colonel Paul Tibbets had to use every inch of the tarmac to get the overloaded bomber into the air. 6 hours later, the Enola Gay reached the city of Hiroshima. At 31,000 feet, the air was still, and the visibility was perfect. At 8:15 a.m. local time, the bombardier, Major Thomas Farabee, released Little Boy. The B-29 immediately lurched upward, relieved of the 4-ton weight, and Tibbets threw the aircraft into a violent 155-degree diving turn. This maneuver was designed to put as much distance as possible between the aircraft and the impending shock wave. 43 seconds later, a flash brighter than 1,000 suns illuminated the interior of the cockpit. The shock wave hit the Enola Gay like a giant sledgehammer, tossing the 65-ton bomber as if it were a toy. Looking back, the crew saw a mushroom cloud boiling up to 40,000 feet, marking the end of one era of warfare and the beginning of another. 3 days later, on Thursday, August 9th, a second B-29 named Boxcar, piloted by Major Charles Sweeney, carried the Fat Man plutonium bomb toward Kokura. Unlike the smooth Hiroshima mission, this flight was plagued by mechanical issues and poor weather. A fuel pump failure meant that 600 gallons of gasoline were trapped in a reserve tank, unreachable by the engines. When Sweeney arrived over Kokura, the city was obscured by smoke from a conventional raid on nearby Yahata. Running low on fuel, Sweeney diverted to the secondary target, Nagasaki. Despite heavy cloud cover, a break in the mist allowed the bombardier to release the weapon. The explosion was even more powerful than the one at Hiroshima, though the hilly terrain of Nagasaki partially contained the blast. By the time Boxcar landed on Okinawa with only minutes of fuel remaining, the strategic reality of the world had changed forever. While the atomic bombings are often credited as the sole reason for the Japanese surrender on August 15, 1945, a cold evaluation of the B-29's role reveals a more complex synergy. The Superfortress did not win the war in a vacuum. By the time the Enola Gay took off, the United States Navy's submarine force had already strangled the Japanese economy. Operation Starvation, the B-29 mining campaign, had finished what the submarine started, effectively blockading the home islands and leaving the population on the brink of famine. Furthermore, the Soviet Union's declaration of war on August 8th and their swift invasion of Manchuria shattered the last Japanese hope for a negotiated peace through Moscow. The B-29 was the final, most visible hammer blow in a multi-front collapse. The cost of this victory was staggering. The B-29 program cost approximately $3 billion in 1940s currency, roughly $45 billion today. This was 50% more expensive than the Manhattan Project itself. For that price, the United States received 3,970 aircraft, many of which were plagued by engine fires and structural flaws until the very end of the war. Critics at the time, and historians since, have debated whether that capital could have been better spent. If the United States had produced 20,000 more B-17s or B-24s instead, would the war have ended sooner? The answer likely lies in the Pacific's unique geography. No other aircraft in the American arsenal could have bridged the vast distances required to strike Tokyo from the Marianas. The B-29 was the only tool that could deliver the strategic pressure necessary to avoid a catastrophic ground invasion of Japan, which was estimated to cost over 1 million Allied casualties. The legacy of the B-29 extended far beyond the surrender ceremony on the USS Missouri. The aircraft became the cornerstone of the newly formed Strategic Air Command. It was the first true intercontinental delivery system for nuclear weapons, serving as a deterrent during the early years of the Cold War. The engineering lessons learned from the R-3350 engines and the pressurized hull paved the way for the next generation of aviation. The B-29 was upgraded into the B-50, featuring even more powerful engines and a taller tail fin, which served as the primary American strategic bomber until the arrival of the jet-powered B-47 and B-52. The Superfortress also had a strange second life in the Soviet Union. During the war, several B-29s had been forced to make emergency landings in Soviet territory after raids on Japan. Despite American requests for their return, Joseph Stalin ordered the aircraft to be impounded. He tasked the Tupolev Design Bureau with a monumental feat of reverse engineering. Every single bolt, wire, and rivet of the B-29 was measured and replicated. Because the Soviets used the metric system, they had to recalibrate their entire industrial manufacturing base to copy the American design. The result was the Tupolev Tu-4, a near-perfect clone of the B-29. When the Tu-4 made its public debut in 1947, Western observers were stunned to see a Soviet Superfortress flying over Red Square, proving that the B-29's technology had changed the global balance of power. The B-29 saw combat once again during the Korean War, starting in 1950. However, the era of the propeller-driven strategic bomber was rapidly closing. The introduction of the Soviet MiG-15 jet fighter made the B-29 highly vulnerable. During Black Tuesday on October 23, 1951, a force of B-29s was intercepted by MiGs over North Korea. Despite their defensive fire, several bombers were lost, and the Air Force was forced to relegate the Superfortress to night missions. The machine that had dominated the skies over Japan was now a relic in the face of jet propulsion and swept-wing technology. Ultimately, the B-29 Superfortress was both an engineering marvel and a strategic gamble. It was a project that pushed the boundaries of what was industrially possible, often at the cost of the men who flew it. It was a weapon of terrifying efficiency that decimated an entire nation's urban infrastructure. It was the progenitor of modern air travel, proving that long-range, high-altitude, pressurized flight was viable. While its development was fraught with technical failures and astronomical costs, it remains the definitive symbol of the American industrial might that characterized the 20th century. The B-29 did not just end World War II. It designed the architecture of the modern world, for better or for worse. The story of the Superfortress is a testament to the fact that in total war, the line between a brilliant innovation and a desperate gamble is often invisible until the smoke clears. The silver giant that once filled the skies over the Pacific now rests in museums, a silent witness to the moment humanity gained the power to destroy itself. Its engines are quiet now, but the echoes of its flights continue to resonate in every pressurized cabin that crosses the ocean and in every discussion of the ethics and efficacy of strategic power. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the history and engineering of the B-29 Superfortress, please consider subscribing to the channel, liking this video, and sharing it with other history enthusiasts to help us continue producing these detailed documentaries.